Paula Mallea has a master's degree in Canadian history and literature and is a criminal defense lawyer. She grew up in Ice Lake on Western Manitoulin Island, where her parents' people were early pioneers. She practiced criminal law for 15 years in Ontario and Manitoba. While in Kingston, she defended inmates in 9 different penitentiaries, spending hundreds of hours at Millhaven Special Handling Unit, Kingston Penitentiary, and other institutions, in the process gaining intimate knowledge of prison conditions. After practicing law in Toronto, Kingston, and Manitoba, Paula retired to Ice Lake in 2004. She is the author of 5 books, most recently Fearmonger and The War on Drugs, A Failed Experiment, as well as the recipient of a Human Rights Achievement Award.
How's it going, Mad Priest family, brothers and sisters? Welcome to another time of getting mad. And today I'm really excited because we have just an amazing woman in our midst, Paula, who is living on Manitoulin Island. She is from Canada, and I can let her tell more about her history and stuff, but she wrote a really amazing book called The War on Drugs, Failed Experiment. This book was written in 2014, I believe it was, or at least published in 2014. So lots changed, but a great overview on the general scope of what's going on, how it got started, what was going on at that time, and talking not just about the world and the U.S., but also about Canada. So it's a really cool international look. But we have her with us today, and so we're going to dig into some history and some experience from her and as a criminal defense attorney as well. So welcome, Paula.
Thanks very much. It's really nice to be with all of you.
So I kind of want to start with something I read, and I was curious if it was true or not. There was an article written about you in the book when it first came out, and it mentioned that when you first were doing your research or first writing the book, that you actually were still on the side of keeping it illegal, or definitely not like a legalization, but your research changed that.
Did it ever? Yeah. And I was in the business of defending people on drug charges for many years and watched a lot of them, probably hundreds of them, going to prison. And I never understood what that was all about, because I felt at the time, these are drugs, just drugs, much like the ones that are legal that we use all the time without a problem, or without problems that we can't deal with. What was the big deal with these drugs? But I can tell you that even after years of this, I still didn't really have a fix in my own mind as to what the proper approach should be to solve what can be a real problem, as long as you're rolling in the heavy duty law enforcement. In fact, what I learned was that the enforcement of the drug laws was what was causing most of the damage, or all of the damage in many cases, not the drugs themselves. The drugs are just drugs. So as I did my research, it became pretty clear to me that the best science and the best public health evidence suggested this should be dealt with as a health issue, not as a criminal justice issue. And certainly my background would confirm that, because I watched my clients come and go to prison, serious prisons like penitentiaries, where I spent a lot of my time. And they didn't come out better people than when they went in normally. So this is kind of a counterproductive situation. In the United States, you've spent about $1 trillion, they estimate, on the war on drugs, and yet you know where you are today with way over 1 million people in prisons, and half of those are there for drug offenses. Remember that most drug offenses are victimless and nonviolent. So we're putting people in prison at extreme cost to the public. For what? To rehabilitate? I don't think so. If you've ever been in one of these prisons, you would realize that rehabilitation can't be easily achieved in the conditions people have to live in. So it took me, a couple of years of hard research before I could come to the conclusion that there's only one solution to all of this, and that is to legalize everything. And in fact, people say, oh my, even the really serious drugs? And the answer to that is especially the serious drugs. Those are the ones that will kill people. Those are the ones that, if they're misused, can make people really sick and cause a lot of disruption to their communities and families. So yeah, especially the most serious drugs need to be legalized so that we can regulate them. And that means we can get a fix on what substances are actually in the drugs that are being sold. And it also means getting organized crime and cartels out of the business. So that's not going to happen as long as drugs are not legal. The only reason they're worth anything is because they're not legal. Otherwise, they're just another transaction that you do daily, like when you go to buy your bottle of wine or your pack of cigarettes. So that's kind of where I was at, and that's the conclusion I've come to. And I, interestingly, am watching the world kind of do a turn right now. They're actually talking about it at the United Nations. They're talking about it in Washington, astonishingly. They're certainly talking about it up here in Canada. So the whole thing, if I want to just do a little bit of history, and I can go all the way back about a century or more, you may not know that people like Queen Victoria quite commonly used marijuana and cocaine. Women used it for pain, for childbirth, and for their periods and so forth. And she did too. And it was quite normal to do that. Coca-Cola had cocaine in it, as you know. Heroin was freely available and on prescription as well. Heroin was given to First World War soldiers who were fighting out in the trenches. And it was Harrods department store would send little care packages to them that included, the socks and things, and also the little package of heroin. And that was to help them get through the pain of what they were experiencing. So it was quite acceptable for a long time, and only started changing early in the 1900s, largely for racist reasons. So in Canada, for example, opium dens were being run mainly by Chinese immigrants. When they passed a law against opium dens, they only enforced it against the Chinese owners, not against the white owners. So that's about as good a piece of evidence as you need to see that the real objective had nothing to do with the drugs and everything to do with the people who were running the business. The same was true in the US. You've read it and you know this story already, that African Americans are targeted every time. And that's partly why the laws were changed to make marijuana illegal in the States, and to also make, to outlaw everything, cocaine, heroin, you name it, it's all outlawed. And African Americans were blamed for a lot of that because those were their drugs of choice. Similarly, when Mexicans started bringing marijuana up, that was that was them. That was more immigrants, more problems. And you've heard this story before, right? So it's been a very racist history. And your numbers and ours prove that. And we need to recognize that that's a serious human rights issue with respect to the war on drugs as well. So it was a very moralistic argument. People were saying, oh my, those drug dens where all those black people hang out, they're, it's all about the sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and it's very dangerous, and they just want to, rape our women kind of thing was the attitude. And that kind of language was used by the highest people in the land. So it was stigmatized to a point where people were terrified of those drugs for decades, and still are. You say the word heroin and people's eyeballs pop, but it's just a drug, folks. So here's where it got really serious. In 1961, the United Nations, under pressure from the United States, passed the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs. And then conventions continued to be passed over the decades that were more and more stringent and caused more and more damage by putting more and more people in prison for very long periods of time.
Were those also pressure, like the conventions that kept going were also pressures from the US? Like, so a lot of those leading conventions were always pressured from us.
Yes, that's correct. And it's largely still the case. I mean, you're seeing changes in the US now, but it's slow, and it's still a serious problem around the world. So, for example, one of the things that happened in 1986, I'm just going to back up a wee bit for that one because it's an interesting story.
Yeah.
In 1986, a guy called Len Bias died. And it was a judge that he died from a cocaine overdose. What he actually died from was an overdose of a number of drugs, including alcohol, but never mind. It's always called a cocaine overdose. This kid was going to be the new Michael Jordan. He was going to be the new best thing in basketball. And he died while celebrating his graduation or something from high school. I forget. Anyway, immediately the U.S. Congress swung into action. And they passed a law that one of their lawyers now says was the worst thing he ever did in his years as a lawyer. It was written on the back of a napkin, and it's the one that sends thousands and thousands of people to prison for very long periods of time for using drugs. So that's a scary prospect to have something like that happen as an incident to one person's demise. Famous though he might be. The other thing that there were many points to the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, but one of them was, and this is where the United States has something to answer for, I think, it required other countries, so say Colombia, right, which is where the cocaine was coming from, to do everything that it could. That nation, that government was supposed to do everything possible to meet the standards that the United States wanted them to meet with respect to the drug war. So that meant, incarcerating people, eradicating crops, the whole 9 yards. And if people could not do that or did not do that, the United States would withhold all its foreign aid and would otherwise interfere with its economic ability to proceed to be a healthy country. That's pretty heavy duty, when it gets to the point where the U.S. is calling the shots in other countries on this kind of thing. So I regard that as a big turning point. And then in the decades that followed that, the sentences got worse. They got to become more racist. So, for example, I'm sure Dr. Carl Hart will tell you this when you speak to him, that cocaine was once white powder cocaine was 100 times, had 100 times the sentence that crack cocaine did. Why? Because crack is cheap and crack is being used by largely both communities, white and black, but it was less expensive. And so it was being used, and it was thought by the administration that it was an African-American drug. So people got really clobbered for using crack cocaine. Whereas white powder of cocaine, that's what all the white yuppies are using. So that's another story. Hey, they don't get hit so badly. That was a problem at 100 to 1. Now it's 18 to 1, thanks to President Obama. Where the 18 comes from, I don't know. But anyway, he did reduce the disparity. It's still a disparity, and they tried to make it retroactive, and that didn't work. So those are the kinds of things that have been happening. And the other one, if I want to emphasize a little bit the influence of the United States on this war, is that the World Health Organization ran a study on cocaine that was international, something like 20 countries, included Canada. And they studied cocaine up and down and came away with a couple of conclusions that the United States was not very happy with. One was, we should not be telling people to abstain from cocaine. We should take the public health approach and teach them how to use it carefully, properly, and not hurt themselves that way. And the other conclusion they came to was that the consequences of law enforcement of these prohibitions of drugs are far more damaging than anything that you can do by using the drug virtually. I mean, you can kill yourself using heroin. Yeah, it doesn't happen as often as you think. But the clampdown on heroin has caused many, many deaths of different kinds and a lot of damage to communities and people and their families, and a lot of damage frankly, to your bottom line and as a taxpayer, because you're paying hundreds of thousands to incarcerate these people day in and day out. So what's the point of that? If you're trying to rehabilitate or teach people a different approach to life or a different way of using drugs, then you do it in an atmosphere that's supportive and helpful and not a prison cell.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. When was the WHO study done?
I'm thinking 1990 something. I'll see if I can confirm it for you later.
So it's like there's definitely like these moments, right? 80s, 90s, where things are presented. I mean, even back in the day, it was pharmacists and doctors who prescribed things, right?
Yep.
So it's like kind of mind blowing because it's not like it was all like ignorance of like we never had studies done.
No,
there were plenty of things. So I think this is total rabbit trail. I'm just curious to hear your thoughts, maybe. But like, do you feel like does Christian nationalism play into this? Because it makes me wonder if it's a moralistic issue and you have this increasing moral majority that is pressuring this concept of the nation needs to be this submitted Christian nation. And obviously we're anti-drugs that, man, that's good. And they're already getting really good politically as far as bonding together. That's one of my scariest things. Like, can we actually change if you have that group of people who are pushing that narrative of a Christian nation, and then therefore we're against drugs and not going to even care or listen to studies? I don't know. I mean, I wonder how much that ties into some of this. I mean,
I don't know either. I do argue in here that, and the evidence is pretty clear that there's a moralism involved in this, that it's to the point where when the United Nations was putting out its drug reports every year, they would take the trouble to list all the ones you know about that are not legal, but they never talked about the really dangerous drugs. And we know alcohol and tobacco are about 4 times as dangerous as the other drugs combined, but they're never even mentioned by the United Nations documents for years and years. So there was all of that going on. I don't know if it's a Christian thing. It certainly seems to be a moralistic thing, and there's a lot of self-righteousness involved here. So you can maybe draw some conclusions from that. I don't know. But you're right that we've been up and down over the decades. And President Carter even raised the idea of decriminalizing at one point, until 5 minutes later, his helicopter went down in the desert, and he needed to do something if he was going to win re-election, which he didn't. But one of the things he did was put the war on drugs back on the podium, which is pretty, that's depressing to have someone like, or an administration like that break down in that way on the war on drugs is kind of scary. In Canada, we started getting reports calling for decriminalization and legalization as early as 1972. Most recently, the 2002 Senate report called for the legalization of everything. They argued that decriminalization was worse than nothing, which is a hard argument to make, but that's how convinced they were about the damage that the war was doing. So yeah, it's been up and down, and largely I have to say, it's quite often the wrong decision has been made on political grounds, because they know there are votes in tough on crime, and they know they'll lose votes for soft on crime. So they have to convince people of the right way to go here. And they don't try very hard, to educate people as to where the damage is actually being done, and how damaging it is to have police, doing the no-knock entry and carrying weapons that belong over in Ukraine, not on your city streets. So as long as that's happening, not enough is going to change. And I'm watching your states one by one taking a chance. They're taking a chance, because the feds are not there yet, and they need to be careful, and they are being careful. But one of the things I was updating yesterday was just to say that I think 15 of the states now have legalized marijuana for recreational use, which is pretty impressive when there was kind of nothing 5 years ago. So so things are progressing, but extremely slowly. Right.
Yeah, definitely. I kind of want to come back to the public health thing. So, you talk a lot about public health as should be the driving policy instead of criminal justice. So talk to us a little bit about that. What does it mean to treat drugs as a public health issue? How does that fit into with legalization? And why that would be a rehabilitative way for people instead of the criminal justice system, which that seems to speak for itself in terms of why it's not.
Well, I'm a little biased because I worked in the criminal justice system for a long time in this area. And I think that, we really have got it wrong in many ways. In fact, we over-incarcerate to a large degree as you do, and for things that are nonviolent and have no victims. So that doesn't really stack up for me. The public health aspect is just to say, and the science is solid on this, and it has been accepted in Canada at least, and that is that people who are addicted, and I use that word carefully because I know it's not politically correct anymore, and it's just a shorter version of saying someone with substance abuse problems, okay, is addicted. And what the finding was, and our Supreme Court made this finding as well when it was finding that our supervised injection sites were legal, and they've said that public health is the way to go because people who are addicted are not making a choice anymore when they take the drug. It's not to get high. It's not to party. It's not to, none of that. It's to make them feel normal. It's to get them evened out and capable of functioning normally, more or less, so they can pay the mortgage and look after the kids. And, and there are lots of people who are addicted to heroin who are good family people, but they have a problem. And the findings that in our country at least, have said it's a disease, it's an illness. We should be treating it that way. We should not be treating people like criminals because of the substance that they use, that they put in their own bodies that doesn't hurt anybody else. That doesn't make any sense. And so that's the argument. And of course, Vancouver in British Columbia has really been the leader in this largely because it's had such a serious problem with street drugs, but also because they've got a very progressive set of people, both in public health and in the government, who are prepared to try these things and see that they work. Our first supervised injection site, Insight, has been running for nearly 20 years. Mm-hmm. They've never had a death happen there. They've saved countless people from overdoses. They've had millions of visits by people coming in to do their drugs there. And it's all good news. And the other thing is, there's a lot of people complain that's just a good place for people to go and use their drugs, And it's not just that. It's a way of connecting with people and connecting them to, health experts and to housing experts. One of the biggest things is to try to get housing for people. So if they're going to be using their drugs, they're not doing it in an alley someplace, using the water from a mud puddle to cook up their heroin and putting that in their arm. No wonder they're dying of disease. Mm-hmm. It saves on HIV transmission. If they can do this safely, it just makes so much sense. And it's humane. These folks all have their human rights just like the rest of us. And they are all people who have families. They've all come from somewhere. And I can tell you that one of our experts in Canada, Gabor Mate, who's been in this business for decades, will tell you. I just listened to him and read got 3 of his books. I can't wait.
Okay.
Yeah. What a guy. And he just says, and he's been at it for years. He will tell you that he's never worked with anybody with a drug problem or addiction who did not have some kind of abuse or trauma in their background, often as children. There's always something there. And now, of course, we know and have finally figured out that a lot of the diagnosable mental illnesses can lead to this. So somebody with bipolar or depression or whatever can also take people down the road to using more drugs than necessary. And and when you've got pharmaceutical companies hard selling something like oxycodone, telling their doctors that it's not addictive, and paying a price for it finally, but not enough. It killed a lot of people, and it's still killing a lot of people in Canada. And we don't have a fix on that one. That one came along just as I was publishing this book. So I didn't go into it, but there's I'm sure there's several books out there now on the opioid crisis. And we're just doing a terrible job at this. And these are not bad people. Let me tell you a little personal story. I had a bad back, and a really bad back, couldn't walk, and went to my doc about it because it was Christmas time and I needed to get through with the company and the turkey and everything else. And she gave me some painkillers. And I didn't know they were Percocet. I knew they were Oxys because that's what it says on the thing, but it's Percocet. So for 8 days, I took Percocet according to the, 3 times a day and everything. My back was great. I got through Christmas. And at the end of 8 days, I quit. And they do tell you to tail off, but it was 8 days. And I thought, okay, how big a deal is it? And I did feel withdrawal symptoms. I was astonished. Wow. I had the cramping stomach and the flu-like symptoms and the pains and aches and everything else. And it took me a day to figure out what it was. And I realized in 8 days, it got me. So that can happen to anybody. I can tell you right now, I pull one out when I need one for my back, but it's usually one pill, because it doesn't take much. Right. So that's just to say any old ordinary elderly lady can end up with a problem.
Yeah. And if you're slightly unhealthy emotionally or mentally, or, then you keep going because I don't want to feel this, or I want to get over this. And so for those listening that maybe, because injection sites are not a common discussion here. What does it mean? So basically in Vancouver, you have Insight, and it's a place where people can go and they receive needles as well. They receive kind of whatever they need. And then it's a place for them to actually use the drug. Do they bring the drug themselves?
Yeah. Okay. Let me start at the start. First of all, there are hundreds of these types of places around the world. So we're not alone in Canada anymore. I don't know if you have any at all. But anyway, there are hundreds of them, and we are opening up more and more all the time in Canada as well, in the larger cities in particular. I just heard on the radio today that the city nearest to me is opening one today, but it's still 2 hours away from me. So it's not helpful to everybody. That's why they've been opening mainly in the larger cities. Okay, so what happens is, and this is the downside of a supervised injection site, is that you have to bring your own drugs with you to the site. So that means you have to score your drugs on the street like usual, okay? And so that way you don't know what's in them, and that's why they're so dangerous if you're using on the street. So you bring them in, they'll test the drug to make sure it's safe. They'll test the drug to make sure it's not so pure it's going to kill you. They sit you down in a hygienic place, and they give you the rig. You have the needles supplied and everything. Everything's clean. There's a nurse or two on duty all the time, so that if anybody's having an adverse reaction, they can act quickly to reverse the problem. And they have people on site as well who upstairs from the main site is where they can house people for, a day or two if necessary, and maybe get them into a program that will help them find housing, or that's a big piece of this. So they do that, and they provide counseling, and they don't push people. They want people, it's most important that people feel valued there. Yep. Which they don't anywhere else. And I noticed that in my practice of criminal law as well, that when people came into my office, it was one of the very few places they ever came where they got any respect at all, Yeah. And quite often they didn't get it from my colleagues who thought they were scum. And I think that's a horrible approach. And I think that that's how we're treating people with drug problems. And we have to get over that. They're human beings, and they're good people. My clients were good people too, but they went to prison anyway. So so that's how the system works, and it's been very successful. But it's been pulling teeth to try to get anybody to let you do it again somewhere else. Yeah.
I definitely see that as like a first step. I mean, it's good that we're decriminalizing in certain states and then legalizing cannabis, but I mean, I think safe injection sites just make sense to at least push as a next step to, again, have a place where there can be respect and dignity had, and checking the drug, because that's a big issue right now. Just everything being laced with fentanyl and things like that.
Yeah. And the idea is to try to keep people alive so they can live their lives.
Really, right?
Keep them alive so that down the road, they may be able to get off the drug that they need to get off. But, in the meantime, keep them alive, because they're out there on the street injecting in horrible conditions, and they're going to die that way, and they do. So so we're not doing the best job, but there's room for improvement for sure. But I'm not seeing in Canada is any hard push to legalize anything else but marijuana. So marijuana was the easy one, because it's just marijuana. But even so, we still haven't got that right either, because our system, they went to the commercial model for selling it. And so here where I live, the only way I can get it legally is through the mail from the government store. And that's not optimal. First of all, it's expensive. Second of all, they're always out of stock, and you find something that works and then you got to look again. Anyway, this is my personal complaint. I take marijuana to try and get a night's sleep.
Right.
And they're not making it easy. Let's put it that way. And it's, that's stupid. It's just silly. Yeah. So
tell us, criminal defense days, like, obviously this is what kind of led a lot to the book and the understanding of drugs, and they're very much intertwined. Quick things like we have 6 months of topics. Incarceration is the next one. And what's funny is when I put these topics together, I put them side by side, knowing they were somewhat intertwined, having no idea how crazily in depth they were intertwined. So I'm sitting here like reading about incarceration month going, this is the same topic. There's not too much difference,
Well, did you know I wrote a book about it?
No, I did. So beyond incarceration. So I was like, I'm going to have Paula on again.
Well, this is where it takes you is the whole thing. When push comes to shove, it's about not putting people in prison who aren't doing anything to harm anybody else. It just makes sense to not do that. So I'll tell you a couple of ones where one that failed and one that succeeded. But when I was practicing in Kingston, Ontario, I don't know if you know about Kingston, but there were at that time 9 penitentiaries within the area. Yeah. And the year the Attica blew up and everybody died, we were having a blow up of our own in Kingston Penitentiary in 1971. So we have that in common. But at one point I was asked to do a sentencing hearing for a woman who had taken LSD into Millhaven Penitentiary, which is a maximum security prison. And she was caught dead to rights. There's no question that she did it. And she would normally because you don't want drugs in the prison and it's a trafficking offense. She brought it into the prison for her husband. Okay, so her story was that her husband was doing time. And as soon as the other inmates found that he had someone coming in to visit with him, they put the arm on him to pressure her to bring the drugs in for them. Okay, that's how it works. And it always has. Yeah. And so otherwise he was going to get badly beaten up or maybe her family on the outside. Anyway, so she did what she was told. She got caught. She's up for sentencing. Now, that now in the States, for example, if you were to do that, there would be a mandatory minimum sentence, I'm sure, for that. And it would be a very serious one. So that would mean that the judge has no discretion whatsoever as to what the sentence might be, never mind what your circumstances are. So there she was. She had a couple of kids. When she would come to the prison to visit him, she had a friend with her who looked after the children. So we go into court. I give the judge the whole story and just say, this is not a case for, a serious prison sentence or any prison sentence. And he agreed with me. It was a Friday afternoon. So he asked her if she had someone to look after her children for a couple of days. And she said, yes. And he said, then that's a 4-day sentence. That means you'll go in today, Friday, they'll book you in, you'll spend Saturday, Sunday, and probably because it's easier for them, they'll probably release you on Sunday. Can you do that? And she said, I can do that. And that was the sentence. Now that's what criminal justice is supposed to be about. When a judge hears all the ins and outs and facts and who the person is and the kids and the whole 9 yards and the extortion that's going on and gives the right sentence. It was never appealed, so it was the right sentence, So that can happen, but it can't happen with mandatory minimums. And we have way too many of them here, which derived from a heavy-duty, tough-on-crime, conservative government in the last decade.
Like the Harper government, they really, I mean, again, I imagine that was a lot of influence from us because, I mean, the minimum.
Oh, yeah.
We
For sure.
And then that kind of the conservative parties, even across nation states, are kind of doing all the same stuff.
They're on the same page for sure. And that government came into power in 2006, at which time the crime rate was dropping like a brick. I mean, the crime rate was down, the drug use was down, the drug crime was down, everything was down. And they came in gangbusters and started cranking up the heavy duty prison sentences for everything and just made a mess of it. So, here we are now. I think that changed in 2015. We got a Liberal government that's moving very, very slowly. Change a few things, the old slowness. Yeah, but it's coming. So, they did legalize marijuana. That's a big deal. So that's a good thing. So I want to tell you about the corruption levels that this can get to. One of the reasons that law enforcement on drugs is causing real problems is because it corrupts the judicial system, it corrupts the government, it corrupts the cops on the street. It's just very corrupting. So the little example that I have from when I was working out west in Manitoba, and a woman came, she was a middle-aged woman. She came to me and had been busted for marijuana use the night before by the RCMP. And anyway, so off we go to court. And I said I'd do the best for her that I could to make sure that her employer didn't find out, because that was going to be her job, right? At that time.
And just for people who are aware, RCMP is what?
Royal Canadian Mounted Police. So,
okay.
So that was our police force largely out west.
Okay.
Anyway, that was all they did all day, as far as I could tell, was drugs.
Yeah.
And when there weren't any, I mean, we're in the prairies and there was some, but nothing serious really. Anyway, here's this poor woman. So we do the sentencing, everything else. And she said, but she told me that what really upset her the most was that the guys that she was partying with when she was using the marijuana were the very cops that busted her. So she has a party with them, one day, and the next day they're serving a warrant to her. And she had to go to court. And anyway, she got sentenced and she did lose her job and the whole 9 yards. And she just said, what's that about? Like, how does that work? And I said, I don't know, really. But I do know that the police don't have clean hands always in these cases. And you're one of the losers on that. And now if it happened
for cops like that, do they have if you're aware, do they have quotas that they have to meet? So it's what drives them to want to pursue drug offenses?
Yeah. The short answer is yes. I was at a party someplace and met an RCMP officer who quite happily told me that every now and again his boss would say, guys, we haven't been in the news lately. We need to, and our funding depends largely on us doing our jobs and putting people in jail and the like. And they'd all go off and do, arrange some kind of a sting and pull in everybody at once. And, big to do with the photo op with all the weapons, which of course, where we lived at that time, nobody carried a weapon for anything really. So they would show a little pile of marijuana as if it was a big deal. And, but it got them the press, it got them the media. And I find that astonishing, but that's definitely happening. There was a finding too at the level of the Supreme Court, I'm going to say, or Senate maybe in Canada, that just found that corruption had worked its way into the judiciary in some parts of Canada, as well as into the government. So, it's astonishing. Yeah, but it's what happens.
I mean, that's one of the areas that I'm most intrigued by too, from a I guess governmental levels. Like, where's the money? Like, generally you can just follow money, and it's confusing because on the drug war, you're like, well, we're spending $50 billion a year. We're spent $1 trillion. And now we have also all the incarceration spending. So where are they making money? And that was the thing that always intrigued me about the story of Harry Anslinger, was like, well, you have this one guy who's basically trying to defend and grow his department, I guess at the goal of making more money for himself and having the stability of that. I don't know, but now it's the same thing. It's like, I mean, so their department depends on these things to get funding, and they don't want to lose their job, I guess, or whatever. So it's just a cyclical thing of money in it.
There's a little power playing going on here too. I think with Anslinger in particular, he was very, very moralistic about what was going on. He was a hard line, this is not right. This is not, drugs are bad, period. Not drugs can be good or any of that. It was none of the news about the therapy that they can be used for. They're very useful that we're learning about daily, how the psychedelics are coming into their own now as a therapeutic way of treating people with depression and other things. Anyway, no, I don't know. And I've had people ask me, so who stands to gain the most from here? Okay, so you've got organized crime out there, and they're doing fine so far. And and who else? I mean, who are these people who are defending so strongly a regime that makes no sense and causes such damage? And you do wonder what's in it for them. Now, for someone like Anslinger, I'm guessing that it's just he believes in it.
Belief, yeah.
And he's got his power and he's going to use it, And the same with Bill Bennett, who was one of the drug czars of yours from years ago. And he was so anti-drug that his language was just shocking. It was so out there. And I'm told, though, that he himself is an addict to gambling, and others have said to cigarettes. So, there's that hypocrisy involved as well. And it's pretty hard for the little guy down on the street getting busted for using God knows what to not feel resentful, to see what's happening with those that are in positions of power and how different it is for them. We had a famous event when Keith Richards was in town to play a concert and got busted for having a lot of heroin with him. And I don't know if they put him in jail for a day or what they did, but it was a big to-do because he's a famous guy, really famous. So what do you do? And again, because our judges then and now largely have jurisdiction over some of this stuff, the judge decided that the best thing would be to compel the Rolling Stones to give a free concert in fundraiser for the blind, I think it was. And they did that, and Bob's your uncle, we're done. He's fine. Keith Richards is still alive, as we all know, or at least they roll him out every now and again. So he's managed to survive all the terrible drugs he's done, So I don't understand why we can't simply take that approach. I really have resented it when my rich clients were treated so differently from my poor clients, or my racialized clients. Right. Where I live, it's about the Indigenous people as much as it is about African Canadians or other immigrants of color. It's largely a matter of Indigenous people getting the receiving end of the justice system, and that's true for drugs as well as everything else. Yeah, so it's a tough one, and I don't think until we settle out some of the self-righteous moralism that's going on, less, I think, maybe here than there. I don't know, but certainly you've pointed out an important thing, and that is that the Christian right, or however you want to describe it, has a lot of power right now. And so maybe that may be going to cause a lot of problems for this area of the law, I think.
Yeah. And I mean, obviously we're dealing with the Roe v. Wade deal, and just, I mean, that's just one area of, decades of something that's existed, and seeing the reactions to that and the polarization that just continues to happen. So I guess my question, to kind of like bring things towards a conclusion, be like, what, like for you as someone who's been in the trenches, but then written about it, if you could observe for the next 10 years, kind of things unfold, what would be your words of exhortation to the general public, to just normal person, myself, whoever? How can we be involved, but also how can we unwind the cultural, I don't know, the cultural thing that has been drilled in us since we were kids, Yeah. Dr. Carl is going to talk about that with you, I'm sure, because he's a great example of a kid that grew up in the projects, and he believed everything he was told about how bad the drugs were, and, you're all going to go to jail. And they did.
And, he came up through that and came out the other end because he was smart and he had a good mentor and he understood what needed to happen. But most people just don't. So from the day I stepped into a court, I took a position that the client in front of me was just the guy next door with a problem. They're just get over it is what I would try to find a more diplomatic way of saying to people. But, just get over the fact that you've been hardwired to believe this stuff is just the devil's potion, and none of it is. And in fact, I could sit down and list within the many benefits that you can get from pain relief, from heroin, and from cocaine, and from marijuana. All three of the ones that I study in this book, they're ideal. And they're plant-based. They're not, chemicals, and they work for people. And the only reason we don't know how they work or why they work or how much they work or how to tweak them to make them work is because they've been illegal, and therefore it was not legal to do the research. So now we're finally starting to do the research, and they are actually doing the research on psychedelics. And I think that people like Dr. Hart are going to be very instrumental in getting the harder drugs looked at as well, because he doesn't put up with nonsense from people.
And I hope that he does, because to his point and others' points, it's great that we're looking at psychedelics, but we're still creating a socioeconomic classism by studying the drug that is primarily used by white middle upper class to have their awakening and go start a business or whatever it is.
Yeah, well, that's what happens. I have to tell you this. When they made
Please do, because I'm in that category. I'm speaking about myself. That's why I'm okay being self-deprecating. It's we need to be. But yeah, okay, tell me the story.
No, I just want, this is a very short comment, but once the marijuana was made legal in Canada, who were the first people to step up and become the CEOs of the marijuana outfits? One was Mr. Zaccardelli, who used to run the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. He used to put my clients in prison for decades sometimes, and now he's out there making a buck and happy doing it. And I'm thinking, what's wrong with this? What's wrong with this picture?
But apparently can't keep it stocked good enough to actually keep his clients happy.
Yeah, to look after people like me. That's right. He can't even run a company. Well, I knew that before.
That's really, what was his name? I want to look him up.
Zaccardelli, Zaccardelli, I think.
Yeah.
He was the commissioner for the RCMP for years and years. And he's not alone. I mean, there were other chiefs of police who are weighing in now. Heavens, our police chiefs are on board with legalizing stuff. They know they're wasting their time on the street doing this, and they have better things to do. And so, when you've got those people on your side, and your local public health officers and your local premier and all of that, that's a big package. And it's hard to argue against the science when you're looking at people who are in the know and understand how this works.
Well, Paul, I want to respect your time. Thank you so much for giving us some insights into this world. My hope is that there's two things I want people to get from this. One, open our minds to maybe what we've been told about drugs is actually all wrong. That's step one. But the other thing is this: can we just be humans? What does it mean to get to know our neighbor? What does it mean to have conversations? What does it mean to engage with people that don't look or sound like us? What does it mean to go out of our comfort zone? And I do the same thing. I choose often to not engage with people because I'm tired, lazy, whatever. But I think if we can get out of our bubble and we can just ask questions and engage, and the more I have done that, that's what's changed me. I'm it's not because I go read a bunch of studies. It's because I interact with people that wow, okay, you're doing
point of view. Yeah,
you're normal, whatever.
Well, we need to be doing an awful lot of that right now, because there's a lot of polarization, not just where you are, but around the world, and it's a very scary scenario. So we have to smarten up, and start engaging with each other. I think that's the best advice of all.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Paula, thank you so much, folks. Even though her book is 2014, it's still a great book to check out. Also, look up Beyond Incarceration, which is her other book, and you'll be hearing more about that in our upcoming months. But check out our resource page because obviously it's got plenty of things to read, watch, and all the above on this topic if it finds interest to you. And in the meantime, Paula, enjoy the amazing area up there in Ontario. And
Thanks so much.
Connected.
Lovely to meet you.
All right. Cheers.
Get mad. Get mad, Priest Coffee.